Hi, Ruth.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Good. Yeah, as good as you can be in the middle of
middle of a pandemic that will end civilization as we know it.
Exactly. Yeah. Apart from that.
Yeah. Well, that's the pandemic has some connection to what we're going to talk about. We didn't plan it this way. Let me introduce us and explain. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available in both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Ruth Whippman, author of the book America the Anxious: How Our Pursuit of Happiness is Creating a Nation of Nervous Wrecks. And being in the middle of a pandemic is relevant both to anxiety and happiness. And so I actually do want to get around to talking about that before this is over. But maybe we should first talk about the book a little, what you're up to. And add, by the way, that you're a journalist. You've written for New York Times, The Guardian, a lot of places. You were, I guess, a broadcast journalist. You made documentaries for the BBC.
I did, yeah. Yeah.
But then you came to America, which led to this book.
Yes.
And in fact, it's funny. I mean, in a way, I think the title sells the book short in the sense that, to some extent, it's kind of a critique of American culture more broadly. But it certainly is a critique of the whole kind of self-help business and self-improvement obsession that you find to be more pronounced in America than in Britain. Yes. But why don't you start by telling us why you came to America and what some of your first impressions of America were? Because I gather the book kind of starts with you having culture shock in a sense.
Yeah. So we moved to America. It's just a little over 8 years ago now. And we came here for my husband's work. I didn't know a single soul. And we had a 1-year-old baby. And we live in Berkeley, California, which is kind of, in some ways a quite unrepresentative place in America. But in other ways, I think it just is
definitely.
Right. But I think in other ways, it's a kind of heightened examples of some trends that you see kind of across the board. So it's like a bit of a hothouse for certain things that you can experience more broadly. And yeah, when we first moved here, I experienced really quite extreme culture shock. I mean, I expected the two places to be broadly similar, but and one of the things that really kind of stood out for me was just this kind of national obsession with the idea of happiness, with finding happiness. And it would just come up in conversation all over the place. I'd be having a very, very casual, low-key bit of small talk with somebody in the grocery store or in the park, with my son or whatever. And they would start kind of almost evangelizing about the different ways and different paths that they were finding towards happiness or contentment or well-being. And people saw this as this really, really intense personal journey. And, in the UK, I think there just isn't that much of an emphasis on that kind of self-development in a way. And I think it is just something that's very, very deep in the American psyche.
Yeah, I guess so. Do you have a theory as to whether it's been that way like forever or, because your book made me reflect on this question.
I do. I mean, I think forever. I mean, nothing's forever, but I mean, I think it's very much in the founding principles of this country, isn't it? Mm. I mean, the pursuit of happiness, it's right there in the very founding documents of the nation. And I think no other nation, as far as I know, has had that in such an explicit way in its kind of legal, ethical, cultural framework as America has. So I think, and I think people do here see it as their right to kind of go and actively go looking for a happy life. And I think that has a lot of huge advantages. And I think it also comes with a lot of stress.
But it certainly, I don't think it used to be as self-conscious as it is. It's hard to say because I have my own form of culture shock. I mean, my parents were from West Texas farm families. And honestly, I felt a sense of affinity with your description of the British attitude.
Right.
It's like in West Texas. And as I recall, you would say, "How are you doing?" to somebody, and they say, "Oh, getting by." And it's like on a good day. And then I came to the East Coast for college and realized that you're supposed to always say you're doing well, even if you're not.
Right. Well, I think there's two kind of trends in America. I mean, one that I've noticed here is that "How are you?" is actually a question. It's like an actual question that people expect an actual answer to, certainly in California. So people will really explore like what they're feeling and what they're going through. And that was interesting, because in the UK, it sounds like, the West Texas in that respect, at least, which is just, fine, not bad. Not bad is kind of the best you can aim for, really. That's the pinnacle. But and also, yes, there's this absolute expectation of positivity here. I think the culture really values this kind of positive attitude.
Yeah, that's, I guess, in a way, I was conflating two things. I mean, I was thinking of a kind of a chirpiness, a kind of just an upbeatness that I think maybe is a little truer of kind of, maybe it's truer of upper class America, because if you're the ruling class, you want to say everything's great the way it is, maybe, but that's not exactly the same as, it's certainly not exactly the same as what you're describing in the book, which is kind of the opposite of always asserting that you're happy. It's always examining the question and trying to change the answer.
Yeah, so it's kind of this tension between the two. It's really interesting that you've pointed that out, because I think there is this like massive emphasis, at least in California, on self-examination and the personal journey and the journey towards happiness. But it's like you're only allowed to come up with one answer. You're not really allowed to come up with the answer, well, actually, I feel kind of average or not that good or, a bit pissed off. There is both this kind of pressure to kind of examine every part of your psyche, and this sort of also this pressure to come up with some really, really great results. Yeah.
So you spend some time in various subcultures of happiness cultivation, I guess you could say. And they have some things in common. There are some recurring themes. In some ways, they're very different. Right. Why don't we go and start, at least, in the order you take them in the book? Early on, you talk about kind of Buddhism, meditation. And I should profess, I wrote a whole book. I'm kind of an advocate of mindfulness meditation, although I have reservations about certain manifestations of it. But I'm not an unbiased
No, it's a really interesting conversation to have. And I think there is a conversation. Yes. So as you said, in the book, I went and did all of these various different, so there's this kind of gonzo element to it where I try out different types of self-help programs, and I spend time in different subcultures, as you say. And I did. So the one of the early chapters of the book is about this kind of emphasis on, isolation when it comes to happiness here, and this idea that happiness is this kind of journey of the self that you basically pursue alone. And there's a lot of data to support it, that Americans really have quite a different attitude towards happiness when it comes to community versus the individual. And so the idea is that it's this kind of personal journey that you kind of look deep inside yourself. And I think this kind of push towards Eastern spirituality, Eastern traditions, has kind of been rolled into this American self-help machine, if that makes sense. So I think a lot of the mindfulness that you see, say, in Silicon Valley or in California, is maybe not quite what you would see, in, Buddhist cultures as such.
No, well, in a number of senses. I mean, first of all, most lay people in Asia, most Buddhist lay people don't meditate. There are some parts of Asia where that happens more than others, but by and large, they don't. The emphasis on meditation is way, just statistically disproportionate in America. I mean, the other thing I'd say is there's a difference between Silicon Valley mindfulness culture, which, as you know, because you went to the Wisdom 2.0 thing has become very interwoven. And we'll get to this whole question of like the interweaving of the quest for happiness with your vocation and the way some companies want to emphasize that and so on. But on the East Coast, go ahead.
No, I was just going to emphasize what you said. It's this idea of productivity and that happiness and enlightenment is somehow tied up in your performance at work.
Right. And on the East Coast, see, mindfulness meditation, it's funny how Buddhism came to America. Zen came to the West Coast earliest, probably, in the 20th century. Then mindfulness kind of came to the East Coast, and Tibetan kind of came to Colorado. But anyway, where I've done my retreats is at one of the really, kind of the first big beachhead one of the first big beachheads at the Insight Meditation Society. And I'd say a couple of things, and I won't spend much time defending mindfulness meditation. I would say I don't think the reason to go into it is to become happier. I mean, that's a fine motivation, and I've said however you get into it is fine. But I think the thing that what should be the strongest selling point is that it helps you see the world more clearly. I mean, that's the claim of Buddhism,
right?
And that's how I would try to sell it. But the other thing I'd say is that in East Coast Buddhist culture, you would hear a lot of cynicism about Silicon Valley mindfulness culture.
I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely. And, this isn't one thing that we're talking about. This is a rich and complex tradition, of course. But I think that the way in which mindfulness, became this huge buzzword and really did get kind of rolled into this self-help mindset, I think was quite telling. And it took on this very American flavor and this very heavy productivity flavor that if you can just think the right thoughts and think in the right way, then, you can either be happier or more productive or ideally both, and I think that was the way that a lot of it was sold. And
you dabbled a little in it. How did that go? What was the context? And
so, well, I went to, I tried out various types of mindfulness meditation, actually, and mindfulness techniques. And I think I wrote about in the book, I went to a Buddhist a temple here and took some meditation classes. And I've got to say, it didn't really speak to me. I didn't respond well to it. And I know that a lot of people do, and a lot of people find it extremely helpful for various reasons. And I got to say, I didn't respond to it either as a kind of effective way of controlling my anxiety or my mind or my thoughts, which I think is how a lot of people see it. And also philosophically, I didn't really respond to it that well either. That makes sense.
I'll give you my final sermon on mindfulness, which I give to everybody is I personally I never responded to it either in those kinds of contexts. I had to do a 1-week retreat, totally silent retreat, before I saw it as anything other really than a waste of time. And even after 2 solid days of meditating, I still was hating it. So I'm a hard case.
Yeah.
I'm a hard case. You may be a hard case. There are people who take to it right away, and God bless them. But what is it about the philosophy you didn't cotton to?
I think a couple of things. I mean, I think one of the problems, and this isn't necessarily about mindfulness itself, but I think it's just about the way that it's sold and practiced in certain ways in America at the moment, is, this emphasis on isolation and silence, that you're sitting, everybody's having their own private internal experience. Whereas I think in years gone by, spirituality was very much a communal thing. And I think one of the main messages of my book, America the Anxious, is that all of the data, I mean, there's such strong research to support this, that the single most important thing you can do for your well-being, both your physical and mental well-being, is to have strong community. And so I think this very heavy emphasis on this kind of personal, isolated journey where you're, essentially going it alone, even if you are in a room with other people, you're doing it very privately and silently, or on your kind of app on your cell phone or whatever. I think that runs counter to a lot of what we know about human well-being. So that was one part of it. And then philosophically, I think this is something that I've seen you write about a lot, and I've really thought about it in detail, but it's about the role of stories in our minds, and what, you've talked a lot about, that we have a lot of stories which are kind of false or illusory, that we tell ourselves, and the ways in which we explain the world, which don't really exist, they're kind of an illusion, and that this is getting in the way of our well-being and our mental health. And I think that's definitely a possibility. I think it's definitely a possibility that stories can be damaging to us. But I also think that stories, at least to me, are exactly what makes life worth living. So, I love stories. Stories are everything. Stories about what human society was founded on, and stories are about how we make sense of our own lives and what makes them interesting. So I think it's sort of about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if they have that expression here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say 2 things. One is that, strictly speaking, according to kind of a more or less mainstream, I guess, interpretation of Buddhist philosophy, all stories are almost, in a sense, arbitrary or false, or they involve interpretation of the bare facts of reality. And so you should be equally suspicious of all of them. On the other hand, as a kind of a therapeutic matter, in other words, in terms of how people actually use mindfulness, It's the problematic stories they usually try to detach themselves from a little, which makes sense. It's like,
right, of course, yeah.
Like I'm a terrible person, that kind of thing.
And so there's definitely utility in it for sure. It's just, I think the idea of a life without stories just seems so bleak to me that I don't want to aspire to that. I think there's a sort of aspiration to a kind of detachment in a way within Buddhism, which to me doesn't feel aspirational. I don't want to be behind the waterfall. I kind of want to be in the waterfall, if that makes sense.
I guess I had never thought of it that way. But have you ever been behind a waterfall? It's cool.
That's true. I haven't actually. I haven't.
You should
and I probably
try
would hate being in a waterfall. It'd probably be horrific. So yeah. I take your point. And it's true that, if you talk about actually trying to approach true enlightenment in the idealized sense of bliss, utter clarity, and a certain kind of detachment or non-attachment, that would involve letting go of all stories and as a practical matter, you don't have to worry about that because you're not going to get there unless you're like an extremely unusual person. But it's a point well taken. And of course, one criticism or one question raised about that is, does that lead to nihilism? You don't care about anything. And there's all that. As a practical matter, it's not that big a deal. So you didn't sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to say that having said that about, mindfulness was never something that really spoke to me at all. And I've written about kind of my objections to it. And I've also sort of written a bit about how kind of being in the moment often to me is like the least interesting part of human thought, that the imagination, the abstract, the future, hope, reminiscence, all of those kinds of things are sort of more compelling to me really than the actual moment. It's the stories we tell around the moment, which makes the moment interesting. So I've sort of written about that in the past. But having said that, and I don't know if you want to go there yet, but, in this particular moment of like mass high anxiety in the middle of a pandemic, I have found mindfulness and being in the moment to be a useful technique. And I've talked about that in therapy a bit as well. So, I don't want to write it off altogether.
In what way why don't you elaborate on that in this context of the pandemic?
Yeah. So I've been doing some teletherapy for anxiety since this. Well, I was seeing a therapist before in real life, but I've been doing it over the video conferencing since the pandemic. And I think, I was kind of spinning out, just in huge anxiety and what if, and my mom's there in London and she's compromised, her chest is compromised and then no one will be able to get to her and she's going to die and there's going to be no funeral because no one's going to be able to get to her and she's going to not have a ventilator and and then, and just spinning off on this massive anxiety. And I think what my therapist was really good at doing was just kind of grounding me back into the moment and saying, you can't know these things, Sorry, there's a plane flying overhead. I don't know if this is going to ruin.
It's not a problem.
You can't hear it. Okay. I think I'll just start that again. But what that my therapist has been saying, which has been really helpful, is just kind of bringing me back to the present moment and just saying, this is all you can be in now. This is all you can know. And
is your therapist in the cognitive behavioral therapy tradition?
He's not, but I think he maybe draws on some of those things. And I have actually done cognitive behavioral therapy in the past, and I have found it quite useful.
Because that has a certain amount in common with mindfulness. I mean, as you're suggesting now, because that is before we get back to the pandemic, the one, my final sales pitch is like being in the moment. I mean, I'm basically by disposition completely with you on all of this. I'm not like the kind of person to be defending meditation or Buddhism, but the thing about being on a retreat is it did give me for the first time the feeling of like total immersion in the moment and my immediate surroundings. And it was, kind of a deep kind of aesthetic experience and appreciation of it all, borderline blissful. And I was just totally devoid of anxiety and worry and felt that I actually had a more objective view of a lot of things. And it's, those are the kind of moments that hook you. But again, I had done what you've done and, gone to sessions, even day-long things and so on, and it's not an easy place for me to get to.
I always kind of wonder how long to keep going, because I remember I had this friend once who said that he hated the movie Blade Runner the first 6 times he saw it, and then on the 7th time he really loved it. I was like, who's going to watch a movie 7 times that they don't like? So, I do agree that so many people have seemed to get so much from it that maybe it is something that I should give more of a go to.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say do what you've been doing 6 times. I'd say either go to a week-long retreat or give up. But anyway, so on the pandemic, it's I was thinking about this, that like what is the mindful view of the pandemic? And in a way, it's just kind of an objective view. I mean, it's just very easy to lose perspective. It's an odd thing, because in objective terms, it's not highly threatening to that many of us. It kind of is to me, given my age and where I am physically. It's like nothing. I'm pretty close to New York. I'm a slightly elevated risk demographic. But the thing is, I don't have very much objective reason to worry about my daughters, even though they're in New York, just because the numbers on how likely,
right, yeah,
and so on. And it's a strange. I mean, when you examine your actual worries, do you find that they have no objective basis or just little objective basis? I mean, presumably if you have older relatives, are they exposed or?
Well, my mom is in London, and she has a history of lung problems and pneumonia. So I think that worry is a genuine worry. And so, yeah, I mean, I spend, on a personal level, I spend very, I can really veer wildly between this like paralyzing anxiety. I read some article in the New York Times. They seem to have a lot of them at the moment, which are all, terrible stories of young people, having terrible experiences with this. And so I'll read one of those and it will kind of knock me out for a few hours. And then I'll kind of step back and get a bit of perspective. But I think there's sort of a difference between personal anxiety when you're locked up in your basement on your own, self-isolating, that is not really effective and it's not really doing anything, and a kind of public health anxiety, which I think is justified.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To make sure that you do the right things to flatten the curve.
Well, concern for humankind is certainly in order here.
Right, absolutely.
I think right after you described the meditation stuff, you talk about the Landmark. Is it the Landmark Foundation? So this is an interesting story. I didn't realize that this is what became of EST.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about EST and what was the name, Werner Erhard, and what that was, and then what it's morphed into, and then how you visited the current manifestation? And
so EST was this program in the 70s, run by this guy, Werner Erhard, or Werner, I guess his first name is pronounced. And it was a very extreme program. A lot of celebrities and high profile people took it. And you were basically kind of locked in a hotel conference room or ballroom for 3 or 4 days, these extremely long days where you were kind of deprived of food and water, and you weren't allowed to use the bathroom, and people were vomiting and soiling themselves, and they would like go very deep into your psyche and, try to, it had Buddhist elements to it, and it had sort of self-help elements, and it had all kinds of, and it was very extreme. It was a very kind of experiential program. And this thing, I'm not sure of the exact timing, but I think in the late 80s and 90s morphed into the Landmark Forum, which is a very sort of sanitized corporate version of the old S program. So it has a lot of the same content and a lot of the same features. Like it's very long days. You're kind of broken down. You're in a large group. They try and go very deep into your problems, and they try and convince you that your problems are basically your own responsibility, your own fault, and you can't blame anybody else for your problems. And they do a lot of work on this storytelling thing, which is like, you are telling stories about your own life which are unhelpful, and to get rid of it. It's a very extreme experience. I did it, and I wrote about it, and I'm careful because the Landmark Forum are extremely litigious organizations, but it is a very, very extreme thing to go through. not as extreme as it used to be in S, but, lots of corporations send their staff on this thing. So you would think that it would be kind of very sort of sanitized and flat and all the rest of it, but it really isn't. It, as an experience to go through, it's quite punishing. Yeah,
you describe a scene where they have they bring like a member, one of the people, one of your peers who has also signed up for it, up to the front. And, and they say, tell us these facts about yourself. And then the teacher either confirms that they are facts or puts them in this zone of like, no, that's not a factual reality.
Yeah. Yes. So they have this thing on their whiteboard where it's kind of like story or fact. I can't remember the exact terminology that they use. But so somebody would get up and they would say, I was born in Poland. And they would say, okay, that's a fact. And then they would say, my parents, I think she said, my parents abandoned me. And that's like, nope, story, because abandoned, it's also loaded. It's a story. And so that's the story she's telling about her own life. So all you can say is, my mother left me in a basket outside the whatever, that would perhaps be a fact. But, and it's this idea of breaking it down. And the tone is very, very aggressive. So it's kind of, it's this real like emotional workout, and she's kind of yelling at you and
And that is a carryover from Est, right? That kind of harsh, like quit whining and take charge.
Yes. And, and it's this idea, it all sort of boils down to this idea that it's all your own personal responsibility, that everything that you think and do and all of your problems are your responsibility. And they don't use the word fault, but basically that's sort of where the kind of feeling that you end up with from it. And I think there's a real tone of victim blaming in it, and a real, I don't know exactly what the mental health community would think of this program, and probably views differ, but it takes quite vulnerable people and they yell at them trapped in a room for days on end. And the days are very long. You're kind of physically exhausted, mentally exhausted. It's got a slightly, I don't want to use the word cult-like, but there's something sort of, happening at a very kind of physical, vulnerable level, I think now.
Yeah, I was surprised that people stick around for it based on your description of, but they pay good money to be subjected to this.
And it's also got this kind of pyramid selling element to it. So every, couple of hours they bring out the, sign your friends and family up and sign up for the next class. And this one's $600. But if you take the next one, that's $800. And then, and this one's a longer one. And then you can train to be a leader. And it sort of has this extreme selling element to it all the way through.
Yeah, I was struck by how different subcultures that you went into could, on the one hand, have similar principles at their core, but be so different. Because at Landmark, in a way, they're doing what mindfulness is partly about, which is to say, no, that's just a story. That's not an objective fact. But the sensibility is so different. I mean, at these meditation retreats, it's all about, it's just common for teachers to be the kind of, don't be too hard on yourself. Don't blame yourself. Like self-blame is one of the big stories that you seem to be encouraged to let go of. And that's not like, this isn't something you find in Buddhist scripture, by the way. It's just part of the modern culture of kind of American mindfulness, at least as I've encountered it. And so you have the same idea in a way, but with the opposite kind of valence put on.
Right. I think that's interesting. But I also I have noticed this kind of, so Landmark Forum is definitely a very extreme example when it comes to the tone and the yelling and the, sleep deprivation and that kind of thing. But that sort of steely thread of, it's your responsibility, it's your fault, it's something very embedded in the American self-help machine philosophy. And you see it everything from Tony Robbins and I think you do see it in mindfulness meditation, actually. Maybe not at its best, but I think there is the positive thinking movement. Oprah is huge on this, this take responsibility for yourself, quit whining. And I think
there's a kind of austerity to serious meditation for sure. It's like you're supposed to learn how to endure and have equanimity in any circumstances. That's true. It's.
And I think sometimes that kind of mentality, this very individualistic, it's on you, it's your fault, you're doing it wrong. I think that can be a really problematic message. And this is one of the conclusions I came to in the book, In America the Anxious, that I think it emphasizes this idea of individualism in happiness, which runs counter to the research about community and social connectedness and interconnectedness. And I think it also really it's this kind of neoliberalism of the emotions, if that makes sense. It's this very individualistic tone, and it kind of really lets systems and social justice and those kinds of ideas off the hook a bit. You can often say, well, you see these memes, they sort of say, oh, happiness is a choice and take responsibility for your own happiness. And it's kind of this constant denial that your circumstances could have anything to do with your happiness, or that you could just be responding to being in a bad situation. So it's not the fact that there's race discrimination or gender discrimination or any of these types of things, or or poverty, or poor wages, or high rents, or these kinds of things. It's all on you.
Although that's another case where these things can assume different valence in different contexts. I mean, at these retreats, these meditation retreats, all you have to do is look at the bumper stickers on the cars, and these are not anti-social justice people. It's a very strong ideological kind of pattern here.
It's interesting that, because I think I see that as well. And like when I went, one of the other things I reported on in the book was the Wisdom 2.0 conference, which it's kind of got an element of parody about it. And it's this Silicon Valley mindfulness conference, and, a lot of extremely wealthy people, exploring their own spirituality. And on the face of it, there's a lot of discussion of social justice, they mention it a lot and it comes up. But I think some of the key messages are sort of working against it as well. So there's this tension there.
Yeah. By the way, did EST, was one of its, was there a lot of EST action at Esalen? Do you know? Have you ever been to Esalen in California?
I haven't been. I know about it. Yeah. I don't know actually whether EST had a presence at Esalen.
I think they actually did.
Part of the same sort of time period and period.
I mean, a lot of stuff happened at Esalen. So, but anyway, speaking of kind of Wisdom 2.0 and the Silicon Valley version of mindfulness.
Yeah.
I mean, there is one thing that some of your book is about is not just, I mean, maybe you could distinguish between kind of bottom up and top down, in the sense that on the one hand, there's individual people looking for happiness and trying to find it. Mm-hmm. But there's the top down thing of like companies and corporations and employers trying to work the quest for happiness into their own hopes about what their workers will do. And I mean, first of all, Silicon Valley mindfulness is a famous, would you call it a version of that? I mean, I
think so. Yeah, I think it's all part of the same kind of mindset, at least, or it's a sort of branch of the same thing. But yeah, I mean, the corporate happiness industry and model is become a huge trend. I mean, you see it in all these big companies where they literally send their staff on happiness courses or mindfulness courses or spirituality courses. And it's this kind of real blurring of the lines between work and self. What really is your employer's business here? And some of it seems relatively harmless. They just kind of go on a day-long course and jump around a bit and get some positive thinking messages. And some of it feels quite sinister. And I think there's a problem here in the sense as well of, we talk about letting systems off the hook. I think a lot you see in corporate America, this idea that, your employer is giving you mindfulness training instead of healthcare benefits or instead of vacation or instead of, so it's not like, and there's sort of a correlation, which I talked about in the book, between the companies that do the most of this kind of happiness stuff and the ones with the worst records when it comes to actually looking after their staff, and things like union presence or, good benefits, good vacation policies, that sorts of thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, the most, I guess the clearest example of this in your book, I mean, the intersection of kind of corporate interest and the aspiration of self-help is this thing in Las Vegas, which I had no idea. I had never heard of this. This isn't super famous, is it? I mean, it sounds like it should be.
It's amazing how little publicity it really got. But yeah, so what happened was I don't know if you've heard of the shoe store Zappos. It's an online.
It's pretty famous.
Pretty well known, yeah. And so the CEO of Zappos is a man called Tony Hsieh, who was very, very influenced by sort of happiness philosophy, positive psychology, all of these types of things. And he brought it very much to his company. And in the book, I visit Zappos, and it's this kind of crazy place which is full of stuffed llamas and bull pits and parades and funny hats and some sort of slightly sinister stuff as well. Anyway, so this guy who was hugely influenced by all of this and had done it to great success in his own company, brought up this huge area of downtown. Can
I just interrupt? When you say he done it with great success, you mean he had convinced his employees that by being the best way to be happy was to be good employees, or they were supposed to make the customers happy, or?
Well, both actually. I mean, I think it's this idea that your life is totally bound up in your work. So they employ people right from the beginning on this idea of cultural fit. And cultural fit in this context means somebody who loves wearing a wig and, jumping around and having a parade and jumping in the ball pit with the stuffed llamas. Kind of my idea of hell, but some people's idea of
you're not a stuffed llama person.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's like mindfulness meditation. I just need to do it 7 times, and then I'll see.
Might take more than 7, but
7 llamas. And so this idea that your work is fun and that it's all bound, and you have to socialize with your workmates all the time, and this real culture of extreme positivity in the workplace. And he took these founding principles of positive psychology, of his kind of happiness model. And he worked as a consultant for a while, I think, bringing this to other companies. And then he basically bought up, I can't remember how many acres, but, a fair amount of land in downtown Las Vegas, which was this kind of really deserted, downtrodden area, with this idea of turning it into a happiness community where everything would be integrated. So the big dream was that he bought all the businesses, he bought all the land, he bought all the the housing, all the rest of it.
So this is right in actual downtown Las Vegas, because last time I was in Las Vegas, it was clear that the action was moving from the downtown casinos to the Strip. But I gathered that by the time he bought it up, downtown had just completely died. It was
pretty much derelict. Yeah. So I mean, there were a few really seedy kind of casinos that was still kind of trotting along, but it was this basically very seedy, derelict area that he bought up, and he tried to run as a happiness community. So he tried to bring in entrepreneurs from all over the country to kind of move to this place and live in this kind of semi-communal way, to greater or lesser degrees, but people were living in this kind of communal housing.
So did they like an entrepreneur would come with his or her employees? I mean, they would locate the staff there, or what?
So he was kind of providing venture capital for these people to come and start their businesses there. So they didn't really bring, I think there probably were companies like that where they kind of moved the whole thing, but it was more people to come and start up businesses there. And he would give them money to do that. And he lived in a trailer in this trailer park, this billionaire living in this trailer in this trailer park, and right in the middle of downtown. And they would have these parties and festivals, and they had this weird kind of surveillance thing where I think this kind of died after a short while, but they were trying to sort of track people on their cell phones in the thing to see how many interactions they were having with other people in this community.
Collisions.
And trying to kind of plot it. Yeah, collisions, that was it. Yeah, so they called them collisions. And a collision was any time that you kind of interacted. And the idea was that they would keep making routes around the city as difficult as possible so that people would have to take different routes to work, that then they would bump into more people and have more collisions, and gathering data on. So there was this slight civil liberties aspect to it, which was slightly skeevy as well. And it was I went there in the book, and it was kind of, it was a very strange place. And also what started to happen was that, and I interviewed a lot of people there, and I talked to a therapist who worked there, and, some mental health professionals. And what started to happen was that there was this suicide cluster, that a number of people in this community committed suicide within quite a short space of time. And, obviously with suicide and suicide clusters, there's always a number of different factors. But I think what people were saying and the kinds of conversations I was having with these mental health professionals and with people involved was sort of that there was something about the pressure cooker atmosphere of this place where everyone was trying to be so, so happy all the time, and the whole purpose, and the pressure to look happy as well as be happy and present as happy was too much for people.
It also seems strange to locate that in a place with so much available vice, It's like, right? I mean, like you can fall down any number of traps in Las Vegas if you're not careful.
Right, that's so true, yeah, and so it can all go horribly wrong very quickly.
So is that still running? Is it still a going thing, and would he still say it's working, or what?
Do you know what? It's interesting because when I visited there, I guess it was 2015, and I haven't updated it since. It'd be interesting to know. I think it's still going nominally. I don't think it ever took off in the way that he wanted. I think they got a huge amount of bad press from the suicide thing. Obviously, that's not great publicity for your happiness community if everyone starts killing themselves. But I don't know what the current status is.
Let's I briefly want to get into attachment parenting. You've actually unknowingly you've stumbled onto another hobby horse of mine in criticizing attachment parenting. I actually didn't realize I was doing it, but it is what we did in retrospect. There wasn't a name for it, but I wrote one of my proudest moments in journalism. I wrote perhaps the classic defense of sleeping with your kids. You're having your baby sleep in your bed. It's called Go Ahead, Sleep with Your Kids or something like that. It was in Slate. It was reprinted in Time. It even got denounced by that guy Ferber. Do you know the Dr. Ferber?
Yeah.
Of Ferberizing fame. Yeah. Who was an advocate of separating he said separating your baby from you and disciplining them like enduring their crying until they just quit crying and they'll learn
right. It was like
a phrase
out like 10 minutes here, 10 minutes, 10 minutes.
Yeah. So anyway, so I should own up to that bias, but tell us your and then I later learned that attachment parenting was this term for that kind of thing, and also just, I guess, spending a lot of time with kids, and I don't know what all it entails. But anyway, you get into this. Tell us about the
right. So I have 3 children, and it's interesting. So there's a lot to say on this. So in the book, I noticed that when we moved here, I had a 1-year-old at that time. And in the UK at that time, the kind of prevailing parenting kind of culture was very much about schedules and routines and do this at this time. And there was this book that everybody bought, which was just absolutely crazy. It was like living in North Korea or something. You were only allowed.
What was the book? Do you remember?
It was called The Contented Little Baby Book by Gina Ford. And it's so rigid. I mean, you read this thing and it's like, I remember being pregnant and reading this thing and thinking, oh my God, my life is over. I mean, it was like 7:01, eat a banana, 7:02, feed your baby a small, whatever, and apply cream to your baby at 7:10. And so regimented. But anyway, this was kind of the norm. And I think that softened up in the UK as well, but this was the norm. And then
isn't that a little bit of a long standing, at least in the upper class? I mean, there's a lot of sending kids to prep school in Britain, right? And where they teach discipline. I mean, historically, at least.
Yes. And still, in the upper classes, kids still go to off to boarding school as young as 6 or 7. And, I think that's horrifically emotionally damaging. I mean, I have a 6-year-old now, and the thought of sending him off to boarding school, I mean, I say this, with complete confidence, it would utterly destroy his life. There's just no 2 ways about it. And mine, But, anyway, well, we moved to Berkeley, California, which was like the absolute pendulum swing the other way. So it was, you wear your baby, baby wearing, and you carry your baby until they're, 40 pounds. And there's all these mothers looking exhausted and like back breaking, walking around with their toddlers, and you breastfeed until they're 4, and you, can never leave them to cry for a moment and respond to everything all the time. And it was this very, very intense swing the other way. And I think both of those are quite absolutist ideas on how, a child is just a human being. And I don't think you really need either extreme of those. And I think people in parenting in particular, I think there's this idea in American culture, whether or not people subscribe to attachment parenting, but this sort of relatively modern idea is that like the parent's job to kind of build this perfectly happy child, and that you can, like this very, very fevered effort, you can create a perfectly happy child so long as you follow this method absolutely and rigidly, whether that's the attachment parenting or the schedule or the this or the that. And I think it's just this very fevered, intense climate. So whether that is, so I'm certainly not against people wearing their babies in slings or sleeping with them at all. And I have co-slept with all of my children at different times. But I think there's something about this very, very absolutist and very dogmatic approach to parenting, and this very, very intense and hovering approach, which I think is not really healthy for parents or kids.
Yeah, well, actually, when I wrote the piece defending it, I was kind of saying the same thing. I wasn't advocating it for everyone. It's just that at that point, this is in the 1990s, Ferberizing was the standard thing for people in our demographic, and you were frowned on if you. It was like you're harming your child. And I looked into it and realized Ferber had zero data showing that it's good or bad to do any one thing, and nobody had good data. And all I knew for sure was that until very recently in human history, people had always slept with their kids.
With their kids, right.
And I just wondered how bad could it be. So it was just a plea for tolerance, really.
Right. And I think that we're saying the exact same thing, because I think then the pendulum swung so much the other way that it was like, if you left your kid to cry for 5 seconds while you went to the bathroom, then your kid would be damaged irrevocably for life. And so I think, it's just about injecting a little bit of common sense. And, funnily enough, I have 3 children, all boys, and my first 2, I parented them in completely different ways because my oldest, I did do quite a lot of the routine stuff just because it was in the culture. And my youngest one, we were there in Berkeley and I kind of went along with what was happening, and he was kind of an attachment baby. And so, he slept with us and I breastfed him much longer and all the rest of it. And I mean, they're different people. Who knows? It's a study of 2. So I don't know what the outcome is. But, I've kind of tried both. But I think they can both become quite guilt-mongering and difficult.
So is the connection of the attachment parenting to the kind of larger theme of the book that, this is an obsession with with building a happy child, or... Yes.
I think so. I think it's this idea that we have a lot of control over the process of parenting, and and it's the same as the self-help mentality. It's just kind of applying it to children rather than ourselves, which is that it's all about effort. It's this idea that, if you work really, 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 really hard at this and doing everything exactly right and follow this method and this thing, then you will get the outcome you want. And I think just this very idea of control and that level of control and sort of micromanaging either your own happiness or your child's happiness is very stressful. We don't have as much control as we think we do.
No, well, I would certainly say in the realm of parenting, having now done it with 2 kids, it's a complete mystery to me what you should do. I'm totally happy with the way they turned out, but I just have no idea what would have been different if I had done things differently in various ways, or why they're the way they are. Because they're quite different in many respects. Yeah. Even though they both grew up in the same place.
Right. And same with my kids. They're 3 very different people. So who knows?
In fact, I think the literature shows that any 2 siblings are almost as different in terms of personality as just 2 randomly selected people.
Really? That's fascinating.
Yeah. It's striking.
Yeah.
And one reason is the environment they have actually isn't shared. They're different. Like one is the older sibling, one is the younger sibling. That's different.
And those are very different dynamics. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you get into Mormons a little, which is it's funny. I've had 2 kinds of contact with Mormons. One is them knocking on the door in this very neighborhood and me feeling just real compassion for these young, earnest guys who thought they had a prayer of converting anyone in this neighborhood to Mormonism. I just wanted to explain to them what zip code they were in. But anyway, I didn't do that. But the other thing is, in the Salt Lake City airport, just like changing planes, you run into a lot of happy people, happy seeming people. And I was wondering, is it like they're just acting happy? So I'll say, why are you so happy? And they'll say, funny you should ask.
It is, yeah.
What is your take on Mormon happiness?
Well, this was the reason why I went to spend time. So I spent time with a Mormon family in Salt Lake City and looked at that culture. And the reason why I chose Mormons to look at is that the data all shows that religious people are happier in general, on average, than non-religious people. And then when it comes to religious people, Mormons are the happiest of all the religions. So I kind of wanted to know why. And so I went to spend time there. And I think one piece of it, and I think for sure one very strong piece of why Mormons report as happier is because there is a pressure on them to be happy. And that's part of the religious culture and doctrine. So I think if a pollster calls from, Gallup or whatever and says, how happy are you? They're probably more likely to say that they're happy. Mm-hmm. So I think that is one piece of it. But I think there is also a genuine thing that Mormons have a very, very strong sense of community and helping each other out. And it's at a very informal level and at a very formal level. So the church has its own kind of very complex and detailed kind of welfare state that exists, so that if you lose your job or whatever, the church will provide for you. They'll give you clothes, they'll give you a job, they'll give you food. So you feel very protected. And there's also this kind of informal network where everybody's always, or certainly when I was there, knocking on each other's doors and bringing cookies and hanging out and doing church, and, which is what we were talking about before when we talked about, the whole sort of isolation thing of meditation and that tradition, but this is very much a community-based tradition. Mm-hmm. So I think that has a big piece of it. But then there's also data to show that people in Mormon communities also have the highest rate of antidepressant use in the United States. So maybe that's why they're so happy. I think
maybe it's a tribute to the power of antidepressants. Now, right. It is, I gather, people, I think, isn't the finding that people in religious communities are happier than average, but that seems to be not because of the religious belief per se, right. but rather the communal part of the living?
Yes. So when they control for that in studies, it's definitely found that it's the social support rather than the spiritual belief that's the key factor there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and this is, as you suggested, this is one of the big, it's one of the big take homes of the happiness research. And also, in your view, one of the reasons we shouldn't make this more complicated than it is, which is that the social dimension of your life is a very important determinant of happiness, right?
Yes, absolutely. And of physical health as well. I was surprised that low social connection has a risk of death similar to the risk of smoking. People who are lonely, and it's about twice as dangerous to your health to be lonely as it is to be obese. So, we put so much emphasis on, going to the gym, dieting, et cetera, but actually, social connection is more important to your health, and your physical health, as not just your mental health. Yeah. So, happiness research is weird. And, I read a lot of studies, there's been 64,000 studies published into, human happiness and what makes people happy. And they're all incredibly inconsistent. So, you can find a study saying that pretty much anything is the key to happiness. And also so is the exact opposite of that thing. So, that there's a lot of inconsistency in the data. But the one thing that is pretty much 100% consistent across the board is that the most important factor in our happiness is our social connections.
Mm-hmm. And the medium of socializing has changed, right? Because more and more of it's online, and you look into this, you get into this whole Facebook effect.
Yeah. So I think that socializing on, I did a chapter all about social media, and I think social media sort of distorts a lot of the principles of socializing. So I think there are definitely huge positives about online socializing, and people can find communities in different ways and connect with lots of different types of people. But I think it's something about the culture which we've collectively developed around using social media that brings its own stresses. There's no reason why it has to be that way, but this sort of, it's like happiness is kind of the currency of social media. The whole point of the way that people interact on Instagram or Facebook or whatever is look how happy I am and look how great my life is. And that can cause a lot of anxiety in people. And there's no reason why it turned out like that. We could have just as easily. And actually, I say in the book that, when we first moved to America, you could blindfold me and read me the Facebook statuses of my friends. And I could tell you instantly whether it was a British person or an American person.
Oh, really?
Because the American ones, were all, feeling blessed, snuggled up with the cutest guy ever on the sofa, having the best day. My kids are amazing. My life, it was all like, it sort of had the tone of the Oscars, this kind of Oscars acceptance speech kind of thing. And the British ones were all like, I'm waiting for a bus in the rain and it's rubbish. And that kind of thing. Like,
well, part of that is just that it's always raining in Britain, or at least it's always grey,
true.
Right?
That is true. It's not a fair comparison, but it's definitely something about the tone that was different. And but that's changed. It's almost like the kind of happiness, that kind of global tone of social media has spread to the UK. So now you just can't tell who's who at all.
Yeah. So are you there was a piece in the New York Times by, I think, Kevin Roos, technology writer, saying one silver lining of the pandemic is that people are starting to use online technology in the way we had hoped for actual genuine connection.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Have you found that? I mean, how much self-isolating are you? Like, you're in Berkeley, so you're basically staying in your house except for like taking walks and things?
Yes. So we're allowed to take walks and you're allowed to go to the grocery store and the pharmacy, and that's it. So absolutely, technology has been a huge part of that. And, and I think it's changed the kind of mechanisms by which we interact, and people, I'm having like Skype dates with friends, our drinks with friends after other kids are in bed, and those kinds of things. So it's that sort of thing which I never would have. You
actually have? Did you say you have drinks? Like, you're both drinking?
So we'll have we'll all have a glass of wine in our own homes, but over FaceTime or Skype or whatever. Mm-hmm. And the kids are doing online classes, and so there's definitely all of that. And I think also people are being the phenomenon that I just talked about, where we talked about the kind of tone of social media, which is like, look how great my life is. I mean, it's kind of hard to maintain that in the middle of a pandemic, so I think people are being a little more honest. It's kind of like, no one's life is great right now, is it? Yeah. So and if you do put on Facebook or on Instagram that your life is so perfect in the middle of this pandemic, you look like a bit of a jerk. So it's kind of, I think that is changing. And I think we'll see, the longer this goes on, I think we'll see much more changes.
Yeah. So I guess final question is, I think you just alluded to this just a couple minutes ago, but how different is Britain from America these days? I mean, I noticed the British title of the book is The Pursuit of Happiness, or the title of the British edition, The Pursuit of Happiness. Why are we driving ourselves crazy, and how can we stop? So presumably you think there's some British people who, or at least your publisher thinks there's some British people who have some of the American disease. I mean, is it becoming more of like a global Western thing?
Without a doubt. I think the differences were much more stark when we first arrived here. I think there was a very strong cultural difference between.
And that was when? What year?
2011.
Wow.
So. And I think it was really, from the tone, from the, like, I literally never heard the word mindfulness before we moved here. And then suddenly it's, mindful childbirth and mindful butchering and mindful.
Well, you moved to one of the epicenters of mindfulness, as it happens. I mean, in 2011, the craze hadn't really swept America fully, but Berkeley, it was not hard to find it in Berkeley.
It was there. That's true. And I think, and that same with self-help, I think there's this like very natural skepticism in the British psyche, in the British culture. It's this idea, people don't want to be too credulous. It's like, just, we've got a natural cynicism, I think, about anybody trying to sell us something or anything, and also this very kind of real, deep realism, it's just like, oh, it's fine, it's okay, not bad. That's the kind of general aspirational tone. But in terms of self-help culture, yes, I think that the British are really embracing self-help culture in a way that they just didn't, 5 years ago even.
Well, my condolences to your nation.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for taking the time. Now, is there anything else you want to say about the book aside from buy it?
No, buy it. Thank you.
Are you on Twitter? Is there a place online people should go to find you?
My website is Ruth Whippman with 2ps.com, and I'm on Twitter at Ruth Whippman, same on Instagram.
Okay. And I'm Robert Writer, Wrighter on Twitter. And the name of the book is America the Anxious, How Our Pursuit of Happiness is Creating a Nation of Nervous Wrecks. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Good luck weathering things in Berkeley.
Thank you too.